Good afternoon from France. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this ESPOL webinar. My name is Sabine Weiland. I'm the director of the ESPOL Lab Research Center for European and International Politics. For those who watch us from the outside, ESPOL is the European School of Political and Social Sciences at the Catholic University Lille in the north of France. If you're interested in more information on the research center and in our school, please have a look at our website. Now, coming to today's webinar on the US presidential elections, American and European perspectives. So we will be discussing a hot and still evolving topic today. We have invited three distinguished speakers and experts on US politics and the US political system. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Matthew Kerbel from the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. Next, I welcome Professor Frank Pryor. He is also from the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. And then last but not least, a warm welcome to Professor François Vergniolle de Chantal from the University of Paris in France. So the idea of this webinar is to reflect upon the US presidential elections from different perspectives, highlighting, of course, the different elements of this complex topic, but also to bring in different perspectives in forms of the analysts from both sides of the Atlantic. And therefore, we are very happy that the three speakers from the US and from France agreed to speak in this seminar. And what I would also like to do is to welcome the participants of this webinar. I hope that you are as well coming from both sides of the Atlantic. You will have later on the opportunity to bring in your questions and comments. And we will manage that via the chat function in Zoom. But first, we will listen to the interventions of our three invited guests. They will speak consecutively for some 20 to 30 minutes each before we move on to the discussions and to your questions. Our first speaker is Matt Kerbel. He is professor of political science at Villanova University in Pennsylvania, US. Matt specializes in American government and political communication and has written or edited 9 books about American politics, initially focusing on the detrimental effects of television on political engagement, and more recently about the emergence of movement politics in the blogosphere and on social media. And he also writes a blog called Wolves and Sheep, Political Analysis from Outside the Beltway. Now I would like to give the floor to Matt. I'm happy to have you here, and we are looking very much forward to your input. And you already said that you are unfortunately required to leave a bit earlier, so we will hear your presentation and then we'll have some questions directly related to your input, and then we'll move on with the other presentations. So Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabine. So we're in the middle of finding out what's going to happen in this election. So since it's something of a moving target, I just want to start with just an understanding of where we are at the moment. It's Friday morning here in the United States, and the balloting from Pennsylvania is almost complete. Given the way the votes are coming in, the pattern of votes, the outstanding vote, it's without question clear that Joe Biden is going to win the state of Pennsylvania, excuse me, and with that, enough electoral votes to become elected president. So at some point today, that's going to be announced. When it's announced, Biden will address the nation as president-elect at some point later today. So we're speaking right now at a time when the election is, I think, just about to move to that resolution. There are still a few other states that need to be resolved, but at this point, once Once Biden goes over 270 electoral votes, then it's over. So because the election is still going on, because we're still so close to it, it's a little challenging, I think, to draw conclusions that that are going to be more than hot takes on what's going on, because sometimes things look a little bit different, even with a little bit of perspective. I suspect that if we were holding this meeting next Friday instead of today, when we have more of the results in, we'll have a clearer sense of exactly what happened and where it happened, and then we would be able to begin to talk about why it happened. Already between Tuesday and today, this is looking to be a much more solid victory for Biden than it appeared to be. In fact, if you look at the popular vote margin right now, it's already aligned very closely with Barack Obama's final popular vote margin in 2012. He won then by a little bit under 4 points, but in that year, he won 332 electoral votes. Biden's not going to be able to reach that, in part because of divisions that have developed in the electorate, which I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. But in terms of what the final map is going to look like for Biden, he'll win Pennsylvania. He won he won Michigan and Wisconsin. Those are the three Midwestern states that Donald Trump flipped. They had been traditionally for a long time Democratic states. Donald Trump was able to win them 4 years ago, and Biden will become president largely because he was able to win them back this week. In addition to that, it looks like he's going to win Arizona. There was just a batch of votes released in Arizona that suggest he's going to win that state. He'll probably win Nevada, which is a state that Hillary Clinton won last time, but it's still outstanding. And Georgia is going to be very close. He leads in the balloting. It'll go to a recount, but it's conceivable that he'll win Georgia as well. So it's going to be a smaller electoral vote victory for Biden, somewhere in the high 200s, or maybe just surpassing 300 electoral votes. But a popular vote margin that looks to be at least as large as Obama's in 2012. That was a comfortable win. And this, I don't think, can be classified as a comfortable win. And that's interesting, because if we look at the expectations going into this election, my theory of the case was based on the data I was looking at, and the data was incredibly consistent. This looked like a wave election. This looked like an election where the American electorate was going to rise up against not just Donald Trump, but against the party in power, against the Republican Party, and sweep Republicans out of office up and down the ballot. And that did not happen. This election did reject Donald Trump. And I think it's clear, if we only had a popular vote presidential number to look at, I think it would be very clear that when it's all done, this is going to be a fairly emphatic rejection of Donald Trump. And that rejection is made even more pronounced by the fact that Republicans did remarkably well down ballot, both in congressional races, Senate races, and in the states. So this was not a rejection of the Republican Party. What we saw was an electorate that was as divided as it was in 2016 come out again, and by narrow margins in a few states, decide that they were going to turn Trump out of office. But they did not turn out and do what they did 2 years ago in the midterm elections, which is give Democrats a sweep of the ballot. They put Democrats back in control of the House of Representatives, and Democrats did very well in the states, in most states. So that didn't happen, which is really striking to me, because if you look at the data going into this election, this was the most consistent election in terms of polling, really since the advent of polling. It was very clear that Biden was ahead the whole time. Trial heats between Biden and Trump going back a year and a half showed Biden ahead. He never trailed in polling aggregates. And in fact, it looked towards the end as if his lead was widening. So what was about a 4-point race early in the year, 4 or 5 points, there was an inflection point in June, and then it became more of an 8-9 point race. Then after the first debate, which was really disastrous for Trump, or at least seemed to be, Biden opened up a lead in national polls that was close to double digits, and then fell back a little, but the polling indicated that this was going to be somewhere around an 8 or a 9 point race. That was clear. It was also clear in the generic House ballot, which I'm going to have to look at more closely in order to understand what happened, because the generic House ballot gave Democrats about a 7-point lead, which indicated Democrats would pick up between 5, 15, maybe even 20 seats in the House. Instead, they actually lost seats. They'll hold their majority, but it's going to be a scaled back majority. And in the Senate, you had all these close Senate races that had incumbents below 50%, which is the danger zone, with their challengers right on their heels, in some cases a couple of points ahead. If a wave election had developed, as the data suggested it would, most of those races would have flipped towards the Democrats, and they would have very comfortably picked up the Senate. Instead, they did not pick up the Senate. Now, there is still a possibility that they will. Right now, it looks like they're parked at 48 out of 100. They came into the election with 47, so it's virtually no change. But there's still a seat in Alaska that's outstanding, which is too close to call. And more importantly, there will be 2 runoff elections that will take place on the first week of January in the state of Georgia. So as if this election wasn't crazy enough, it's not over. And it's not going to be over for a long time, because those 2 special elections in Georgia, runoffs of contests that were held this week, where no party got above 50%. Georgia law requires that if no one gets above 50%, it goes to a runoff. Well, that didn't happen. So there will be a runoff. The Democrats can take control of the Senate by winning those 2 seats. If they don't win those 2 seats, then Republicans take control of the Senate. It's pretty clear that the electorate did not give Democrats majority control of government. And if they get it, it's going to be by the narrowest of margins, and it's going to be after another very expensive and harrowing campaign that's going to play out over the next few months. So, we're going to go from quarantine New Year's Eve right into this election, and that will determine the outcome in the Senate. And that's incredibly important because whoever controls the Senate is going to determine what's going to happen with domestic legislation in this country. So that remains to be seen. Going back to the wave. So there was no wave, but there was a sea change. And I think that's equally important to note. This is a sea change election in the sense that the Trump experiment, if you want to call it that, was rejected by the American public. So now Joe Biden, who ran on a message of unity, who ran on a message of bringing the country together, now has to step into what is a particularly harrowing and difficult moment and find a way to get that done. Because the other way I looked at this election was that I felt we are at a realigning moment in American politics. Had we had a wave election, then this election would have been a realignment, probably similar in many ways to 1980. We did not get that in the sense that it was not definitive, but I do believe that there are signs of realignment in this election, but the realignment is gradual. And if we look at realigning periods in American history, they're all different. They all come about in different ways. The one thing they have in common is they mark the end of a regime cycle and the start of a new regime cycle. And it typically happens when the old regime is unable to meet the challenges of the moment. And I think that, that criterion is in place. But what I see happening in this country has shades of 1980, shades of 1932, and ominously shades of 1860. And I think there are elements of each of those in what we're going through now. What's forcing the realignment in this country is an unprecedented generational change in our politics. If we look at the political preferences and the concerns and the ideological predispositions of millennials and Gen Z, they are entirely different than the preferences and ideological considerations of older generations. The older generations are shrinking in number, and as they shrink in number, they begin to lose their grip on power. And the emerging electorate, the rising electorate, which is younger, more multicultural, more progressive, is gaining in power. And as these two sides become relatively equal in power, you have an explosion. And that's where the United States is now. The explosion played out in this election in a way that was not decisive. And the reason for that is because the United States currently is like two freight trains connected to each other going in opposite directions. You have a red electorate that came out in incredibly large numbers to support Donald Trump. You had a blue electorate that came out in incredibly large numbers to repudiate Donald Trump. The blue electorate numerically is larger than the red electorate. That's why you see a popular vote margin that's going to be not very close. But in terms of the way voters are distributed across the states, there are many states that are very, very close. And that's why we've been staying up since Tuesday to get the results from these states where you're just looking at a handful of votes out of millions and millions cast, including right here where I am now in Pennsylvania, where it's very close. So, so what does this mean? The thing that I see about the 1980 realignment is that it was very slow in coming. And I felt for a very long time that the moment we're in now reflects that. This is a realignment that's very slow to emerge because it's generational. And it just takes time for the new electorate to come of age and to be able to be large enough in number to exert political power. You know, I've said a lot of times over the last few years, I can give you a very clear picture of what I think our politics are going to look like in 2030. But next 10 years, that's a very, very tough call. How do we get to that? Because it is very clear that the United States is changing. But look at what happened during the last time we realigned. Nixon's election in 1968 didn't really look significant. It was a narrow election, but it really began the process of an emerging Republican majority and the end of the New Deal coalition. It played out over many years. It was basically anticipated by Nixon. It was realized at the presidential election, at the presidential level by Ronald Reagan, but it wasn't realized at the legislative level until the Gingrich Revolution of 1994. So you see this realignment that's taking place over a long period of time, really from 1968 to the mid 1990s, that we're kind of going through something like that in reverse. But if you layer on top of that, the fact that the electorate now, or the country, is facing crises that require immediate attention. The virus, obviously, the pandemic, the economic crisis that's being driven by the pandemic, a moment of racial awakening that played out at a very salient level over the summer. There is a crisis in confidence in our institutions. The United States is at a crisis point. And like 1932, we were at a crisis point. But in that moment, the country handed everything over to the Democratic Party in large numbers. And Franklin Roosevelt was able to move the country in a different direction. But I'll call him President-elect Biden, even though it hasn't been called yet, but he will be later today. He will not have the latitude to be able to govern the way he had been speaking during the campaign, where he saw himself governing in the image of Franklin Roosevelt with a second New Deal. That is going to require, at very least, some kind of legislative control, at the very least 50 senators. And even if he got 50 senators, that's barely a majority to work with. So he'll be restricted in what he can do. So we have 1932 level problems, but Biden's not going to get a 1932 level mandate. And then you have 1860, which is the most troublesome of all of these, where you have the country really completely divided over what's going to happen next. You have a scenario where it's really about the potential loss of power and privilege by groups that have been empowered for an extremely long time, and who are fighting that, and who want to give that up, don't want to give that up. One of the things that puzzled me when I looked at the results of that are coming in now is, I thought coming into this election that it would be really very easy to predict, because presidents, when they're up for re-election, get their job approval number. They just do. I mean, we look back, it's pretty clear, right? So what was Trump's job approval number? 43 somewhere, maybe 44. That's what we would predict he would have gotten. And without a significant third-party presence on the ballot, Biden gets the rest. That made sense. That's what we were seeing in the presidential head-to-heads. It was an 8-point, 9-point race. That made a lot of sense to me. But what we're seeing is wherever the popular vote number lands, Biden is going to overperform his job approval. So what that means is there are people who are voting for, I'm sorry, Trump is going to overperform his job approval. So what that means is that Trump is getting people to vote for him who don't like the job he's doing. And that tells me that people are, some portion of the electorate will vote for Trump independent of what he does. Right? I looked at some of the exit poll data, and by large numbers, people do not like the way he's managing the pandemic. His approval is deeply underwater. And you know, that was one of the top issues of concern to people as they turned out to vote on Tuesday. Well, if that followed from what we traditionally see in elections here in the United States, then Trump would have lost in the landslide that it looked like he was facing. But the fact that that didn't materialize suggests to me, and I need to look more closely at the data, it suggests to me that people were not voting primarily or exclusively on job performance, that people were voting for other reasons. So what would those other reasons be? I can only speculate at this time, but what I suspect is that there's some element of the American electorate that is voting for Donald Trump as a defense against the changes that this country is experiencing. And if that's the case, it doesn't matter what kind of a job he does. It doesn't matter if they don't like the job that he's doing, and it doesn't matter if they don't like him personally. They want to keep him in power because they see him as a bulwark against these changes. And that's where we get to 1860. That's where my concern is that Biden will come to power now significantly at a time when he needs to address both a series of urgent crises and this broader division in the electorate that's going to be extraordinarily hard to face. He has run as a unifying candidate. He says he wants to be the president of all America. America right now is a divided country. It may be divided 55-45, but it is still divided. And the dilemma he faces is that people, you can only unify people if they want to be unified. If they don't want to be unified on your terms, they're not going to listen, they're going to fight. So he will face a challenge that I think his background suggests he's up to. But and I'm going to close with these thoughts. The election, not only is the Senate election not over, but the election itself, if you include the transition, is definitely not over. We already heard the president last night make false claims about voter fraud, which was designed to signal his supporters that they should not accept the outcome. That speaks to a potential crisis of legitimacy for the Biden administration. We still do not yet know how Donald Trump himself will accept the outcome once this is called. We don't know what he's going to do. We don't know, I would imagine he will be enraged, but we don't know how that will manifest. But we do know that there's a long lame duck period in this country between now and the 20th of January. And during that period of time, he will remain president. I'm certain he will continue to fight the election. I'm certain he will continue to delegitimize the election. At the same time, Biden's going to need to put together his transition team very quickly, or team's obviously in place, but he'll have to take steps towards his transition very quickly. And then when he becomes president in January, it's going to be an extraordinarily challenging thing to do, to try to speak to the whole country in a way that that people will listen to. So we're going to have to see how this goes. I think the next few weeks will say a lot about what we should expect coming out of the transition. But it was an interesting election because at one level, it was a very clear repudiation of somebody who has governed with autocratic tendencies. And I think it's worth stepping back for a second and recognizing that democratic mechanisms worked in the sense that the people voted, and we are going to make a change. So on that very important level, I think that's something that should not get lost. But at the same time, we're also facing tremendous divisions that run very deep and a rolling realignment that's happening very slowly. So with that, I'm happy to answer a few questions before we move on to our other speakers.
Sabine, before Matt takes this question, are you still able to hear me? This is Frank Pryor. Okay, my screen has gone blank. I just wanted to make sure I'm still connected. I can't see anything, but I can hear Matt just fine. Can you see me?
Yes, we now see you.
Okay.
Maybe Chantal, you can kind of bring on all speakers now so that we can have a little chat together. Good. I think this.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Very soon. Yeah. So here you are. Yeah, thank you very much, Matt, for these very interesting reflections. As you said, you will have to leave quite soon. Therefore, we will just have a round of questions now. And I would like to invite the participants, to the audience, to submit their questions and comments in the chat function if you have any comments or questions. Of course, I would also like to invite the other speakers to raise points that you would, as a comment maybe, or some remarks to what Matt just presented. I don't know if this is the case from your side. Otherwise, I will have. Okay, let me just begin. So what I found interesting, Matt, from your input was that. How you depicted the current change that is going on in terms of the electorate, the American people, basically, and how much this is a generational change, and that we see, and how that might continue. And I was wondering whether this younger versus the older generation, whether this is the only cleavage. I would not assume that this is the case, because there are so many other conflicts as well. And I particularly wanted to mention two here, namely one about the elites and the well-off people, well-educated people on the one hand, versus the ordinary people, normal people on the other hand, which I think is also produces a lot of dynamics. And then, of course, racial conflicts as well. I think these are two additional very important cleavages that we see in the US. How do you think that this comes in relation to the generational change that you over the longer run depicted?
That's absolutely right, Sabine. And just to clarify my comments a little bit, the reason that I spoke of this as a generational issue is because when you think of it in terms of realignment, what's going to ultimately move the country in a different direction is the emergence of these younger generations, eventually, and actually over the next decade, to become a majority of the American electorate, and then be able to influence government in a way that they have not been able to do yet. So from a realigning standpoint, I look at this generationally, but you're absolutely right. There are economic cleavages and there are racial cleavages, and we can overlay those on the generational cleavages. Certainly, if you look at wealth inequities in the United States, they're at unprecedented levels. There is enormous economic pressure on the working class. And if you look, just go back to the election, if you look at where Biden, the way Biden won the election was by going back to the industrial areas, we call the Rust Belt portions of the United States, and putting majorities together that spoke largely to a combination of voters. It's sort of an interesting coalition. Educated voters, people who are attached to the new economy throughout those areas, but also to some of the working class white workers or voters in those states, to try to bring them into a coalition that I think he hopes will enable him to govern in a way that might address some of the economic disparities that we're seeing. Now, of course, without a legislature to support him, he's not going to be able to do that. But we have these economic cleavages that are certainly contributing to the tension that we see. There's one more thought about that. It'll be interesting to see how the data look at the end of this election. But if you look at the data from 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton carried far fewer counties than Donald Trump, but the counties she carried amounted to close to 3/4 of the American gross domestic product. She's carrying the new economy, and Biden did as well. So there is that division. And then, of course, the racial division, which I think is the driving force of Trumpism and the overarching issue in the country. So there's no question. And of course, if you think about the racial divisions generationally, the millennial generation and Generation Z are far more racially diverse, far more racially tolerant. So, so that change and that conflict is absolutely driving our politics. I think it's driving our politics more than anything. I think that's what Trumpism is about.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that answer. François, you want to come in? Go ahead.
Oh, I just have a quick question for Professor Kerbel. I was just wondering about the part played by the Supreme Court in this election. Do you think it is a realistic assessment to think that the court could decide the election just like it did back in 2000? I mean, my own understanding would be to say that the Supreme Court is in 2020 nowadays is very different. It is in a very different shape than the Supreme Court in 2000, and that the current court will not take the risk of deciding the election. But that's just my take, and I would be curious to know what your take would be on this point.
Yeah, well, you're right, François, that this is a completely different Supreme Court than in 2020. I'm sorry, than in 2000. But I think we're also in a different political situation in 2020 than we were in 2000. The Bush-Gore election was a tie, and it was a tie in the Electoral College. It was a virtual tie in the popular vote. Al Gore ended up winning the popular vote by a few 100,000. So it was a much closer election than this. And you just happened to have the state of Florida split down the middle with irregularities in terms of how the votes were tabulated. So the Supreme Court ultimately stepped in and decided that election. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a student of judicial politics, but I don't see any valid legal basis for challenging the election. That doesn't mean that the Trump campaign won't try. Right. They're already trying, but most of the attempts have been swatted down. And you can't go to court and say, I want them to stop counting the votes because they're going against me. That's not going to go anywhere. And especially if it turns out that if you're looking at Biden flipping a number of states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, possibly Georgia, that's an awful lot of vote to have to reverse in order to change the outcome. So I think that there will be lawsuits. Trump is famous for suing everybody. I don't think there's anything to stop him from doing that. There will be, I think, a couple of recounts. I think the recount in Wisconsin isn't going anywhere because Wisconsin was decided by 20,000 votes, and you don't flip a state where the margin's that wide. It's about as wide as Trump won the state by 4 years ago. Georgia's a different question. Georgia, I think, is going to be tight. I don't know what the final result is. That's a place where a recount could matter, but it won't affect the outcome once Pennsylvania comes in.
May I pick up some of the comments we receive in the chat now? So there is a question on the role of the media, social media in particular, and so maybe you can comment on the role that social media is playing in the election outcomes. So one participant is writing, may the results of this election may also be stem from the decrease of power from pro-Trump media that pushed him to power in 2016. So what is your view on the general influence of the media, and particularly on those media who are pushing Trump?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. What does the decrease in power refer to?
Good question. I understood that the influence of the media that are pushing Trump are declining, which will result in eventually the victory of the Democrats potentially in this election.
Okay, so if I understand the question, it makes reference to a decline in the power or influence of Trump-supported media. I don't see anything like that. I think that if anything, I think that you're going to see what we've seen for a long time, which is we live in a siloed media environment where people live within their own echo chambers if they want to. And one of the things that I think makes the whole prospect of coming together as a country so profoundly difficult is that we do not live in a world where we accept the same set of facts as a point of departure for our understanding of the world. And that is directly because of the media ecosystems we live in. So, the effort to delegitimize the vote that the president is engaged in is designed to cycle through that particular, a conservative media ecosystem where it will have credibility. And a lot of people are going to feel like this election was stolen from them. And that's why I'm waiting to see what the reaction is. I'm expecting Biden to speak at some point today. And after this is called, we just have to see what the reaction is. But I do think that that speaks to just an essential problem because it's difficult, it's if not impossible, to maintain a democracy when we have two camps that just don't agree on what they're seeing.
Yeah, sure. I pick another question, and then I think for you, you need to leave, if I understand that correctly. So how about the divisions within both parties, within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party? So what do you think, how will either new president or either leading figure in each party deal with the cleavages they are facing in their own parties? So Biden won't be able to deliver for the more liberal Bernie fraction. The Republicans will have to deal with Trump sticking around. So how about that? These internal dynamics within the parties?
That's a great question, and it's an incredibly important question. I think we have to wait for the dust to settle on the election to first understand what the governing situation is going to be, because this is not a clear-cut decision. If this had played out the way the data suggested it was going to play out, and it was a clear repudiation both of Trump and Trumpism, then I think Republicans would have had a lot of soul searching to do. But I don't see any reason right now why, if Mitch McConnell remains the majority leader of the US Senate, he won't go around obstructing the entire Biden agenda the way he obstructed the Obama agenda. There's no reason politically for him not to, unless it looks like that's going to be a problem for his Republicans going forward. As far as the long-term health of the Republican Party, I think that's a very important and open question, because the other piece of that is we don't know what the Republican Party looks like without Trump. Trump came in and staged a hostile takeover of the party, and he basically is the party. Now he's going to be out of power. He won't be quiet. So do his supporters follow him? How do they follow him? What does this mean for other Republicans? A little thought experiment that I did while I was watching the results, and they came in and they were just so different than what the data suggested. So I asked myself, counterfactual. Let's say Mike Pence is at the top of the Republican ticket. Do we get turnout patterns that look like this? I'm not so sure we do. I don't know how much of Trumpism is transferable beyond Trump, especially if people are not voting on job approval, and they're not voting on likability. They're voting on him, right? So I think the Republican Party needs to figure out, how does it move beyond Trump? There is, I see a question over here that speaks to the Hispanic vote for Trump in Florida, Texas. Doesn't it undermine the image of a clear-cut division in the electorate based on race? Well, yes and no. I mean, it's speaking just of the Hispanic vote as a monolithic vote has always been mistaken, because it's much more subtle than that. I think, I do think that race remains the driver in our political divisions. But again, on the other side, what do Democrats do? Let's see if it's possible for Democrats to govern at all. There is going to have to be attention paid by the incoming administration to the progressive faction of the Democratic Party. One of the reasons that Joe Biden is going to become president is because Democrats came together. Bernie Sanders actively campaigned for him. Elizabeth Warren actively campaigned for him. He owes a political debt to that wing of the party, and yet he cannot govern as a progressive. How does that work? So we are a country in the middle of a slow and very painful transition to something that looks so different from what we were, and we are becoming that country, but we're doing it at a pace that doesn't match the urgency of the moment.
Good. I think, Matthew, you have to run now.
I do, yes.
I think we should leave you here. Thank you so much for your interesting input and for answering the questions.
Thank you so much for having me, Cindy.
Yeah. Have a good day, and thanks for attending this conference.
Thank you.
That gives us the opportunity to move on to our next speaker, or maybe we can now do the two speakers in a row and then have an overall discussion. So next we are having the input from Frank Pryor. I introduced briefly our speaker to you. Frank is an assistant teaching professor of political science at Villanova University in the United States, with a teaching and research focus on race and politics, on campaigns and elections, on public policy, the state and local government. Frank has worked in state and local government, and he is a former candidate for the state legislature in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Frank published research examines Black urban megachurches in major American cities and their role in providing social services and their engagement in political activism. Frank, lovely to have you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share with the conferees. It's always a challenge to follow Matt Kerbel. He's wonderful and kind of laid the groundwork to kind of set up what I want to discuss. I kind of want to focus on three things I'm paying attention to right now with this election. I want to make some comments about the composition of the eligibility of the Black voters in this election. I want to briefly look at the Democratic and Republican strategies for engagement and outreach to the African American vote. And then lastly, some brief thoughts about what the Black ask will be, ASKS, what the Black ask will be if there is a Biden administration, and really dovetails into Matt's comment about Biden cannot govern as a progressive. So he would have some challenges there. When I look at the number of Black Americans eligible to vote for president, it's reached 30 million here in the year 2020. With more than 1/3 of that 20 million living in some of the nation's most competitive states, typically called swing states or battleground states. Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Do those states ring a bell? Those are the states that we're talking about right now in terms of deciding the election, right? Nationwide, Black eligible voters make up 12.5% of the US electorate, and that's up from 11.5% in 2000. So it's grown. For many years, Black voters were the largest non-white racial or ethnic segment of the US electorate. But for the first time in presidential election history, they'll be outnumbered by eligible Hispanic voters at 32 million. For this year's presidential election, we found that 63% of Black registered voters were extremely motivated to vote. That were the thoughts going in. I'm very interested to see what the exit polling will show. Furthermore, among those who support Joe Biden, over a third said they plan casting their ballot via mail-in ballot. So we knew this going in. We knew the contours of what the electorate was going to do on the Democratic side. They were going to mail in general, and African Americans in particular, right? We're going to use that new method. The Democratic Party has maintained a strong advantage among Black voters over the decades, generally garnering around 90% of the African American vote from 1965 forward, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that's actually the year that Blacks were actually able to cast an effective vote in American politics. So it's really only been for the last 55 years that Black Americans have been able to cast an effective vote. Black eligible voters by no means are a monolith. Their views, demographics are very different. In the states with competitive races for president, Black eligible voters have varied levels of education attainment, income, immigrant populations. So just some key facts about the Black eligible voters living in this year's battleground states, the ones that we've been paying a lot of attention to here in the US. Again, Black eligible voters make up varying shares of the electorate in battleground states. In Georgia, which I think is just about to be called, as I'm looking at CNN, it looks like it may be called for Biden pretty soon. In Georgia, the state's 2.4 million Black eligible voters make up 32% of the electorate. 32%, the highest share among the battleground states. Meanwhile, in Arizona, right, which is a new battleground state, that every Republican has won since 1952, except for 1996, Black Americans account for less than 5% of the electorate. Look at those battleground states. Georgia, 2.4 million, or 32%, right, are Black voters in the electorate. North Carolina, 1.7 million, 22%. Florida, 2.2 million, 14%. Michigan, 1 million, 13%. Pennsylvania, 1 million, 10%. Ohio, 1 million, 12%. In Wisconsin and Arizona, less than 4%. Well, 4 and 5%, but less than 4 million, right? So from 2000 to 2018, the share of the Black eligible vote increased by 5%. In Georgia, the largest percentage point increase of all the battleground states, right? And I've just shared with you the other states. Trump won all of the battleground states in 2016 by a razor-thin margin, right? Particular interest for us was what? Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which here we've been calling the blue wall. And it looks like in this election that Biden has won them back, right? In those states in 2016, 14 million votes were cast, and Trump won that by 78,000 votes combined, right? And we know 44,000 here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Across most battleground states, a majority of Black eligible voters live in the top 3 largest metropolitan areas in the state. What's interesting when you look at maps of the electorate, you hear these new terms, red states, blue states. But in fact, you need to really tear that apart a bit, right? And look at the urban core and the metropolitan rings that surround them. In the urban core, you're going to find Black, brown, concentrated poverty, high density Democratic voters. For example, in the city of Philadelphia, I think it's 875,000 folks are registered Democrats and about 150,000 Republican, right? And the surrounding collar counties. And this is replicated in all of the battleground states, right? In Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, a large majority of Black eligible voters live in these metropolitan areas. In Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, Black eligible voters are more evenly distributed across the metro areas, right? So you take that into consideration. That's where you see your reds and your blues, but the blues are concentrated in that urban core. Matt started to talk about the generational piece, right? 4 in 10 Black eligible voters are millennials or Gen Zers. In all the battleground states, millennials, those ages 24 to 39 in 2020, make up a slight plurality. 29 to 40% of all Black eligible voters, right, are millennials. Gen Z eligible voters, the oldest of who turned 32 this year, make up 15% or less of the state's Black electorate. Gen Xers and baby boomers each make up around 1/5 or 1/4 of the state's Black voting public. And those who are members of the silent or the greatest generations, those older, comprise less than 1/10 of the Black eligible voters. The same phenomenon that Kerbel was talking about in terms of this generational divide, right, is no different in the Black electorate as well, right? They're getting older, right? They're moving on, and there's a new generation that's coming in to fill the void with a different set of expectations from elected and appointed officials and from government. This slight generational difference is reflected in the median age of each respective group. The median age of the Black electorate is 44 in 2018, which is the latest number we have, while the nation's overall is 48. About half of Black eligible voters in battleground states attend at least some college, right? So the educational levels are important here to point out. Just over half of the Black eligible voters in the battleground states of Georgia, Carolina, Ohio, and Florida, it's over 50% attended college, right? While the shares are slightly lower among those in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, which is 50%, this is an educated electorate, right? Nationwide, more than half of the Black Americans, 54%, who are eligible to vote have at least some college education. This includes those with an associate's degree, compared with the 62% of US eligible voters overall. Economics and income. The median incomes of Black households differ significantly among battleground states. Those residing in Arizona have the highest income levels within the 6 battleground states at $50,000, followed by those in Georgia with $45,000 and Florida with at $41,000. In North Carolina and Pennsylvania, Black eligible voters had a median household income of $38,000, respectively. Overall, the median household income of the nation's Black electorate is about 2/3 of the country's entire eligible voter population, right? 40,000 versus about 62,000, right? So some of them are educated, they still fall behind whites, and their median incomes are significantly below whites. While median incomes can vary wildly among states, income inequality also exists among Black Americans overall. Black Americans near the top of the income distribution, the 90th percentile, had incomes 9.8, about 10 times greater than that of incomes of Black Americans their income, the bottom of their income distribution. So there's a wide range in terms of the economic situation for Black Americans. It varies widely, which speaks to the kind of messaging that they'll receive and where they kind of lay in terms of their how they make the electoral decisions. Poverty and health insurance coverage among Black eligible voters varies in these battleground states as well. In terms of poverty rates, Black eligible voters in Wisconsin report the highest shares of those living in poverty among the battleground states, followed by Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, all around 22, 23%. All of these exceed the shares of those living in poverty among the Black eligible voters, 19%, and US eligible voters, 11%. The uninsured and poverty rates of Black eligible voters reflect national, racial, and ethnic disparities that have been exacerbated with the corona outbreak and the virus. Black Americans have accounted for disproportionately higher shares of COVID-19 deaths and also experienced widespread economic hardship. One more piece around the Black electorate. Naturalized immigrants account for nearly 1 in 5 Black eligible voters in Florida, by far the highest among battleground states. When we think about the Black electorate, we can't think about it as a monolith, right? They're American-born Blacks, those Blacks that are born in America, and then Black immigrants that come from across the globe that populate different regions, different segments of these battleground states. Immigrants have been an important driver in the growth of the country's Black eligible voter population. Between 2000 and 2018, the number of immigrants in the Black electorate almost tripled from 800,000 to 2.3 million. And their shares doubled from 4% in 2000 to 8% in 2018. This is according to US Census data. The 2 top regions of origin for this electorate are the Caribbean and Africa, with these regions accounting for 50% and 41% of Black immigrant eligible voters, respectively. This reflects trends among the overall Black American foreign-born population. The top regions of origin can differ greatly between these battleground states. In Florida, the vast majority, 92% of its Black immigrant voting public hails from the Caribbean nations such as Haiti and Jamaica. In Ohio, by contrast, 84% of its immigrant Black electorate was born in African countries such as Ethiopia and Somalia. So it's important for us to know a bit about the Black electorate in these battleground states in the variety of ways that the Democrat and Republican parties gear their outreach to them. So it's important to know where they're located. Next, I want to just briefly make some comments about the Black voter outreach or engagement efforts by Democrats and Republicans. I think it makes sense to start with the current president. There's been actual very little outreach by the Republican Party. I'm sure many of you have famously heard Mr. Trump say that he has been the greatest president for African American population since President Abraham Lincoln. He has said this on numerous occasions, and more recently, only about a week or so ago, right? The most significant president to Black Americans since Abraham Lincoln, which on its surface is nonsensical. There's been no outreach by the Trump administration in any significant way, or the GOP to increase its Black support. But it did, however, meet with some success. We're seeing here from early exit polls, right? Moving the needle from maybe 3% to 5%. Largely, Trump makes these overtures and makes these claims mainly to appear to the white electorate that he's not racist, is my assessment of that. Outreach by the Democrats. Matt Kerbel did a good job laying out the shortcomings, some of the shortcomings of 2016 and Hillary Clinton. And so Democrats, the Democratic Party and party elites have been reaching out and engaging the Black electorate for the last 4 years in a very concentrated, strategic, purposeful set of initiatives, spending a lot of money, and most recently from the conventions on this summer all the way up to the election, via radio ads, TV ads, multiple digital platforms. You asked Matt about social media outreach. The social media outreach to young Black Americans has been historic by the Democratic Party. The party has opened itself up to approaching that that demographic of the Black electorate, looking with an eye towards the future. The 2018 midterm election blue wave that happened in Congress, right, a repudiation of Donald Trump, but certainly also the taking over of the House by the Democrats. Many young Black congressional females elected to office are part of that new wave, and they were very much instrumental in driving the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, to invest in the youth movement and in the Black electorate. And so this has reaped results. Of course, it's early. We don't know all the results, but my sense is that those efforts have paid off. And also traditionally, something that's been below the radar screen, during this cycle has been the role of the African American church. I mean, traditional civil rights organizations, certainly, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, National Urban League, NUL, and a whole host, Legislative Conference on Civil Rights, have been active and engaged. But the Black church for the last 4 years has been organizing in significant ways in all of those battleground states that I just mentioned. And think about this Black urban church phenomenon. We define urban churches as those that have memberships in excess of 2,000 members. Philadelphia, Detroit, Michigan, Los Angeles, Milwaukee, Dallas, you name all the major American cities that have populations in excess of 200,000, they all have Black urban megachurches with congregations the size of 1, 2, 3, 10,000. I actually belong to one here in Philadelphia, and it has 14,500 members. They have been organizing in significant ways in terms of voter registration, voter education, and in the context of the pandemic, moving towards mail-in ballots. Hence the reason that you see so many mail-in ballots coming in, right? Trump told his supporters to go election day. Democrats told their supporters to mail it in. So those efforts have reaped benefits for Democrats in general, but also increased voter turnout for African Americans as well. So the Black urban megachurch and the churches have played a significant role, and that can't be understated. And the last piece I just want to bring up is talk about briefly is just Black ass, right? So 90% of the African-American population, wherever it's located, has been giving its votes to Democrats. And let me just backtrack for one moment. I mentioned Georgia as a battleground state. If that state has not been called yet for Joe Biden, but if it is called, I mean, that's been a solidly Republican blue state since it was won by, I believe, Bill Clinton. If that turns blue, that's the work of Stacey Abrams, who ran statewide, African-American female, and who lost 2 years ago and ran statewide. The kind of organizing that's happening in states like that may be a bellwether and a kind of shift that Matt was talking about earlier that's going to take some time. Because what you're finding there is that down ballot, they're electing what? State legislators, state representatives, mayors of major American cities, school boards, county commissioners. And so at that level, it looks like that turn is actually happening in this election. If it swings the Biden way, we may want to take a further kind of look at that. But circle back to Black ask. So what would Black Americans ask for? Matt made the comment about how difficult it would be for Biden to govern as a progressive. So in terms of full disclosure, I worked on the Warren campaign. And so when you think about those on the left, the Warren, the Bernie Sanders, et cetera, right? And if Biden has a split Congress, right, there'll be some difficulties there in terms of what Black Americans will ask for beyond what's traditionally offered, which is the cabinet level position, right? Undersecretary position, right? But at this point, when you look at the racial disparities that exist in housing, in healthcare, jobs and economic development, employment, public safety issues with the racial reckoning that's happening, I think the demands for Biden are going to be very difficult to manage. And the asks of these Black organizations, which are very diverse, right? They're not unified in any kind of a way. There's no leader, if you will. It'd be very interesting to see what they coalesce around and what the demands and asks are of a Biden administration. And I'll close there.
Good. Thank you very much, Frank. Let's have 1-2 questions to you directly, and then move on to the third speaker and have an overall discussion in the end. To ask, I found very interesting what you said about the outreach to the Black and also Hispanic population and the engagement that the both of the parties are undertaking. My question is, in which ways have those outreach activities changed? And I would like to connect that with one question that was asked earlier in the chat. In which ways have the, in this case, the Republicans be able to craft new coalitions with minorities? This comment is referring to the Hispanic vote for Trump in Florida and Texas. But maybe we can also deal with that question on a more general level. What do you see in terms of change, how the parties reach out to the Black population and the Hispanic population?
Well, I can speak a little bit to the Latino Latinx population. I mean, so again, they're not Matt made that comment. They're not a monolith, right? And so if it's Cuba, if Southern Florida, then those are Cubans and they're a Republican Party. And let's be crystal clear: Donald Trump spent millions and millions of dollars in radio ads labeling Joe Biden a socialist, and it worked, right? But the Hispanic population in New York, that's Puerto Rican and that's Dominican, right? And if it's Mexican in Arizona and California, it's Mexican. So they're very different, right? In terms of the appeals. Since the 1980 census, we've been talking a lot here in America about how demographics is destiny, right? The 21st century, and by 2040, 2050, it's going to be a majority minority nation, right? And then the Latino population, will that manifest in any kind of electoral victories and political achievement or advancement, et cetera? We may finally be beginning to see that possibility, but it's been slow in the making. But if you think about Arizona, they've been organizing in Arizona for 10 years, 700,000 Latino registered voters in Arizona, and they've been registering to vote and pressing forward on social justice issues for 10 years in Arizona. So you got to kind of disaggregate that and kind of look at the different segments across the country. That's number one, I think, around that population. When you think about GOP outreach for Blacks, I go back to George Bush, right? 2000, compassionate conservative, the faith-based initiative. He reached out to Black churches who want to see themselves as being more effective beyond church walls in the communities in which they deliver religious services, but they also provide a social safety net. And so that's Bush in 2000, right, which is 20 years after Reagan in 1980, who pulled a lot of federal support from major American cities, pulled that away. And so churches filled that role. And Bush came in as a compassionate conservative and actually raised his support in the African American community up to around 11 or 12%. And then it just kind of waned away. It kind of went away. I agree with Matt around, it depends on who the titular head of the Republican Party is if Donald Trump loses in terms of what the GOP will do in terms of outreach. We don't know what that's going to look like generally across the nation. So I tend to want to kind of look at that regionally, where those Black and brown people are, where those Hispanic people happen to be. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
No, I'm just trying to figure out and ask
you asked about new outreach.
Those engagement activities and also development or changes in forging coalitions between parties and different parts of the population.
Well, that's always been a challenge, right? If you look at states like California and the Los Angeles era, the Hispanic population, Latino population, the African American population have always been at odds. There have always been opportunities for coalition because there's a shared set of interests, right? In all the areas that I just mentioned, healthcare, housing, jobs and economic development, public safety, all those kinds of things. But there's never been a real coalition at the national level. You see it sometimes in local elections, mayors, county commissioner, school board, but there's a lot of friction, a lot of tension there. And that's going to be one of the challenges if there's a Biden administration, when you talk about Elizabeth and Bernie and those on the left and progressive and forward thinking, how can they begin to cobble that together and what's that going to look like? My sense is you've really got to have young people as part of that. You've got to engage young people to begin to do that work, get that kind of a buy-in. So I think about the Ayanna Presleys from Massachusetts, my hometown of Boston, actually, who we helped elect to the first African-American congresswoman from Massachusetts, right? Alexandria Ocasio, right? Cortez from New York, right? The young ones. I kind of look to leadership from them, right? And so it will be interesting to see what kind of a role that people like that will play in a Biden administration, to kind of speak to what you were talking about.
Yeah. There's another interesting question in the chat now about voting patterns between African Americans with and without immigration background. So do they vote for Democrats at similar rates, whether they are did immigrate themselves or whether they are born and raised?
Yeah, American-born Blacks versus those that come from the African diaspora and come in popular. Yeah, I get it. It's really interesting. They tend to vote Democrat at a rate of like 9-1. I'm trying to think of certain segments of like those from the Caribbean, Trinidad. I mean, they tend to be more fiscally conservative, but they're socially liberal, particularly from the Caribbean, which is interesting, and we'd have to take a deeper dive of that. But largely 90% in the Democratic Party, with very little difference there. Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's leave it here for the moment and move on to our third speaker, and then we will have an overall discussion also across the inputs. So I'm very happy to welcome our third speaker in this webinar, François Vergniolle de Chantal. He is Professor of American Politics and Government at the University of Paris in France. François specializes in US political institutions, ideologies, and political thought, and also in elections and political parties. His recent books include an edited volume on Obama's fractured legacy, the politics and policies of an embattled presidency, which was published in 2020, so this year. And currently, as I know, he's working on a book project on compared republicanisms between France and the United States, in which he analyzes the different facets of the Republican traditions in both countries over the past 50 years. François, great to have you. The floor is yours. Oh, you have to unmute your microphone. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes? Okay, so well, thanks for having me. I won't be commenting on the elections and the results, because this has been done by our first speaker today. I will just start off by saying that election returns now are clearly hinting at a Biden's victory as we speak, but we still don't know what Trump will do and how recounts and judicial actions will play out. What we know, however, is that the Republican Party has been profoundly impacted by 4 years of Trump, and that's actually the issue I would like to address. The party has been impacted not only in ideological terms and in style, but also in electoral terms. So I would like to discuss in my presentation each of these elements and discuss the way the GOP, the Grand Old Party, has changed under Trump. And eventually, I like to conclude on the fact that Trumpism will most certainly survive Trump, which will have highly detrimental consequences for the Republican Party. So I'd like to first take a step back and remind our viewers, our audience, of the way Trump campaigned in 2015 and 2016. He campaigned against the Republican establishment. He campaigned as an outsider, and clearly Trump was not the party's choice. And this way of campaigning had a cost, a steep cost, once Trump was in the White House. Indeed, the incoming administration had very poor relations with Republican majorities in Congress. And this was illustrated by the fact that Trump failed to enact major legislations on his key items during the campaign. For instance, the wall at the border and the repeal of Obamacare. Instead, what happened was that the Republican Congress enacted its own priorities, which essentially boiled down to two main issues, tax cuts in 2017 and conservative judicial appointments. So in other words, what I am hinting at here is that Republicans in Congress, at least in the first Congress of Trump's presidency, Republicans in Congress used the Trump administration for their own political advantage. And the administration itself had a very limited influence on congressional Republicans. And that was the short-term legacy of the 2016 campaign, as well as the result of Trump's short coattails. I don't know if everyone here knows exactly what coattails are, but we may discuss it a bit later. So nonetheless, or nevertheless, Trump had the means of influencing Republican officials. He basically was in charge of the RNC, so the Republican National Committee. And also, that's certainly more important, Trump could activate his base of supporters during the primary season so that Republican candidates running for re-election and who would have been critical of the administration could risk being, quote unquote, primaried out by Trump voters. And so that's how things started to change for the 2018 midterms. And with those midterms, the Trumpization of the party, or at least the Trumpization of the party's congressional branch, progressed. It sort of set roots, so to speak. Indeed, the Never Trumpers retired. They left office. John McCain died in the summer of 2018. And so Trump was left with a Republican caucus for his next Congress that was much more in sync with the administration's priorities. And news reports like 538 or Axios have compiled Trump scores, meaning how often a member votes in line with Trump's position. And those Trump scores reached staggering levels among Republicans. So this evolution had limited consequences in terms of governance. Because in 2018, I mean, the House got a Democratic majority, but the consequences of that shift were major for the Republican Party, as illustrated by the unique decision of the 2020 Republican Convention not to draft a new platform, but instead to use the 2016 platform. That was a very surprising move, and a move that was replaced by another even more surprising move, which was to get rid of the platform altogether. So in 2020, basically the Republican Party sent the signal according to which loyalty to Trump, loyalty to the administration was what mattered. So the next question I would like to touch on is the following. It is to ask if there was any ideological substance to that Trumpization process. And the answer is a resounding yes. After 4 years, Trumpism has been given a substance through practice, through executive actions, international treaties, and presidential statements. So at first, Trumpism can be defined as yet another example of charismatic leadership with no real coherence other than to follow the leader. The fact is that Trump followers have often been compared to a fan club or even to a cult. And there is a symbiotic relation here between Trump and his supporters. So I will get back to this later in my presentation. Another fact that goes in the same direction is that Trump's ideas seem to be a mix or a hodgepodge of left-wing ideas and right-wing ideas. Left-wing ideas like protectionism, infrastructures, or even Trump's commitment to preserve Medicare and Social Security. These are left-wing ideas, basically. And also at the same time, right-wing ideas, so the wall at the border and immigration. Plus, I'd say that the way in which Trump has or had a complex or questionable relation to the truth is another example of his lack of ideological clarity and substance. But there are at least two other elements that make it possible to find and to identify more coherence in Trumpism. The first of these elements is Trump's constant positioning as an outsider. And so this is an interesting point because many analysts initially expected that Trump would somehow wisen up, that Trump would somehow come to his senses when confronted to the realities of politics and public life. But that never happened. Trump kept on breaking each and every public norm. And to me, this has to be understood as sort of a constant nod to his supporters, to Trump's supporters, to show that he remained true to them and that he never became another Washington politician. He would never be mired in the infamous swamp that he criticized during the 2016 campaign. So somehow Trump's populism and his breaking of norms are related, are part of the same tactic. But there is also a second element that I would like to highlight, and that's a second element that was visible as early as 2015-16. Trump activated what used to be called in the 1990s, and that's a strange sounding word, no doubt. The word is paleoconservatism. Paleoconservatism, an expression coined by George Nash. And this expression refers to nationalist ideas of identity, as well as an anti-liberal positioning. It also has a negative ring to it, obviously, because paleoconservatism implies that there is somehow a sort of a dark side of conservatism, a repressed side, which is based essentially on racial resentment and on culture wars. And so typically paleoconservatism has been linked to, for instance, George Wallace's campaign in 1968, when he criticized, quote unquote, reverse racism. But it has also been applied to Pat Buchanan in 1992, when Pat Buchanan, in a very infamous speech, explained that there was a culture war being waged in the US. And so up until Trump, this movement, paleoconservatism, was largely hidden. And it has now entered the mainstream of American politics. This is the main legacy of Trump. So you could say that Trump played the race card. But what he did actually went a little bit further, according to me. What Trump did was that he used the rhetoric of identity politics for the white community, which to my knowledge is a first. And there is a very famous article that people could read, a very famous article by a no less famous Black intellectual, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote in The Atlantic in 2017 that Trump was indeed the first white president. What does that mean? It means that Trump was the first president to use identity politics for the white community. And more largely, I would like to make an additional comment. Trump promoted what has been called a disfigured Americanism, a disfigured Americanism that played out on the international stage as isolationist and unilateral, and that Trump presented as a defense of nations against global trends. Let me just share two examples here. In October of 2018, Trump declared himself a nationalist at war against globalists. A globalist who he defined as, and this is Trump speaking, so I quote, a globalist defined as a person who wants the globe to do well, but frankly, not caring for our country so much, Trump speaking. And Trump repeated the same claim, that's my second example. Trump repeated the same claim in front of the UN General Assembly in September of 2019. He said, and here again I quote, the future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations. And he carried on by saying, if you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation. So these are two elements making up what you could call Trumpism. The positioning as an outsider on the one hand, and paleoconservatism, sort of a mix between ethnic and nationalist pride. What do those elements tell us about Trumpism? There is an easy answer to that question. The easy answer is to say that Trumpism is another instance of right-wing populism. But this answer, at least for me, is not fully satisfying. And it's not satisfying for at least two reasons. The first of these reasons is that populism as a category is a very broad one, a very broad category. A category which is applied nowadays to both progressive movements. The label populist has been used for Bernie Sanders, for instance, and also a label applied to conservative movements. So in other words, this label is so large that it doesn't explain much. Second reason for my being skeptical of the word populism is that there is to me, and that can be discussed, there is a tendency among American analysts to consider that right-wing populism is somehow alien to their political culture. It's not part of their political culture, or at least it is minor, it is structurally minor. And there are reasons for many American analysts to think that way. Indeed, populism in the US doesn't have the same history as populism in Western Europe. Populism in the US, and that's its main characteristic, populism in the US has progressive credentials. From the People's Party in the late 19th century to Bernie Sanders nowadays, and maybe also including the New Deal in the 1930s. And that's not the same story in Western Europe, not at all. So again, that's my point of view. It seems to me that right-wing populism tends to be dismissed by American analysts as, quote unquote, a form of a paranoid style, which is an expression I borrow from Hofstadter in 1964. Also, and that's of more recent vintage, right-wing populism is something that cannot last. Trump, for instance, according to that line of thought, Trump would be a moment and not a long-term trajectory. That's why I think it's best to revisit the notion of populism when applying it to Trump. And to do so, to revisit the notion, I would like to rely on a typology by a French political scientist, Pierre-André Taguieff, who wrote an article on the meaning of populism. And he presents populism as a continuum stretching from the left to the right. And so he goes on in that piece, he goes on to explain that there is a great diversity in the shapes populism can take. And he especially elaborates on one category that could be applied to Trump. He calls that category populism attitude. Populism attitude, but the word attitude has a different meaning in English, so populism behavior maybe. And according to Taguieff, this behavior is independent from ideological traditions. It is independent from structured ideological traditions. It is not politically located or situated. It is what he calls an idealization of the popular. And this type of behavior is highly, especially visible with Trump. I would like to go deeper on that count, Trump is often described as being non-ideological. But my point will be to say that Trump is mostly sub-ideological. And there is a difference to me between both. There is a difference between being non-ideological and being sub-ideological. Trump is sub-ideological. He has no ideological sophistication whatsoever. And he turned that characteristic into a political asset, because many among his supporters share precisely Trump's lack of ideological sophistication. You could say that Trump has a lot of appeal to low information voters. Low information voters who don't pay much attention to politics and who share a mishmash, a mix of centrist and extreme beliefs that are usually uninformed. And my point is to say that Trump thinks about politics precisely like a low information voter. He doesn't care about ideological coherence. He keeps on personalizing politics. And that behavior enables Trump to speak his supporters' language spontaneously. And I would like here to make a comparison between the way Obama speaks and spoke and the way Trump speaks. This is actually a pretty obvious this difference, but there is some substance to it. Obama was highly respected for his rhetorical skills. He delivered lofty speeches on all issues. But Trump does not deliver speeches, never. Trump is simply talking to people. He's simply talking when he addresses his supporters. And so this characteristic was widely derided by the media, the press, and the academia. But this is actually pretty efficient in terms of relating to his supporters. All of these elements I've outlined were useful in explaining Trump's electoral survival, at least so far. But my next point and my final point is to say that what's good for Trump is not necessarily good for the Republican Party. And here I would like to elaborate on two scenarios. The first of these scenarios is what the Never Trumpers of 2016 argued, meaning that Trump is an accident. Trump is a short-term phenomenon. Lots of Republican groups have been vocal in their criticism of Trump lately, especially governors dealing with the COVID crisis, but also organizations like Republican Voters Against Trump, or the Lincoln Project that aired a political ad that I found very good. It was called "Mourning in America," and that was a clear hint to a very famous political ad back in 1984 when Reagan ran for re-election. And that 1984 ad was entitled, "It's Morning Again in America," morning and not mourning. The morning ad of 2020 concluded that America was weaker, sicker, and poorer. And that was a clear contrast to the 1984 ad that ended by saying that America was prouder, stronger, and better. So that's just one remark in passing. I found the ad pretty interesting. So for those people, the people criticizing Trump, Trumpism is some sort of an equivalent to the radical turn that the Democratic Party took in the 1980s, when the Democratic Party shifted to the left. And that turn was, that shift was remedied by a return to the center and a return to power in the 1990s. So these groups are looking forward to presidential defeat, to push their agenda and to recapture the Republican Party and shift it back to more traditional values. But that scenario I've just outlined is not the most probable, even if Trump loses the 2020 race. And at least for two reasons. The first is that Trump's defeat, to be confirmed, Trump's defeat is razor thin, and it is no rout. It certainly came as a surprise for Democrats, and we've discussed that earlier in our session. But there is no anti-Trump blue wave in 2020. At this stage, and I was just reading about that earlier today, Trump got 4 million more votes than in 2016. And there is a similar increase for Biden when compared to Clinton in 2016. But again, Trump got 4 million more votes than in 2016, which is pretty huge, and which is also a clear sign that Trump has strong support among voters, including, for instance, and here again, this was a surprise, including, for instance, Latinos in key states. But Democrats also lost seats in the House of Representatives, which was completely unexpected. They failed to conquer the Senate, and at the local level, Republicans seems to be keeping the edge that they have had since 2010. So it remains to be seen what constituencies stuck with Trump and what constituencies did not. But the fact remains that Trump was not repudiated. And also another factor I would like to highlight is that the challenge for the Republican Party today is not the same as the challenge for Democrats in the 1980s. Republicans are not facing a debate between moderation and radicalism. Republicans are facing something else. Republicans are facing the disintegration of the Reagan Revolution inherited from the 1980s. And so I was quoting Hofstadter earlier, and I would like to quote him again to say that Republicans seem to be stuck in a politics of nostalgia, made up of resentment, made up of discontent, and made up of constant or near constant scapegoating. And so to that extent, my argument would be to say that Trump represents an exhaustion of the conservative revolution. The grand old party, to me, seems to be brain dead. It is mostly rehashing a Reaganism that dates back to the 1980s. And there are many examples of that, starting with Trump's slogan in 2016 that was taken from Reagan's campaign in 1980. Make America Great Again is not Trump's motto. It was first Reagan's motto in 1980. And Trump's choice topics are also echoes from the 1980s. The criticism against the deep state, tax cuts, deregulation, law and order, all that reminds people of the 1980s. So intellectual innovation or intellectual renewal is clearly not the order of the day for the American right nowadays. So to conclude, the second scenario is certainly the most probable. A Republican Party that has lost its ideological bearings, and whose only coherence is to convey the discontent of an increasingly shrinking white community, especially its most impoverished and fragile segments. To that extent, then, Trump is maybe the first illustration of future Republican leaders, namely charismatic, polarizing, and angry leaders. So that doesn't mean that the grand old party is doomed to losing elections in the near future. We know, and Republican pollsters know, that the capture of discontent is an efficient, most efficient electoral tactic. But the GOP is nonetheless confronted with an existential challenge if it remains only buttressed by a somehow narrow white support base. And so I'd like to end here by reminding our audience today, reminding them with the 1874 cartoon by Tom Nast that pictured the Republican Party as an elephant falling over a cliff. And this is maybe what we will be witnessing in the coming decade. And that will be my final word. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, François, for your rich and very thought-provoking input. I would like to invite the audience again to leave their questions and comment, and I see that there are already some coming in. Let me begin with my own question that I have before I can read what is currently going on in the chat. So you were talking about the relationship between Trump and the rest of the Republican Party, and you said that this is a kind of a tense relation for now. And there's movements and currents like the Lincoln Project and other currents that are kind of anti-Trump, if you want, at least to some extent. My question is related to I think we can say shocking remarks that Trump made over the last days regarding the stop the voting, so clearly undemocratic, we can say, statements. And I'm wondering, how can it be that none of the other Republicans is kind of reacting on that, or maybe I'm missing something here. So there seems to be no debate about that clearly undemocratic behavior. And I think, I mean, what is the reasoning for that? Do you have any explanations on how that can be explained? That there are not, I mean, I got your argument on Trumpism and on the new policy style, but why is that? What are the other Republicans at the moment doing while all this is happening?
Well, I think that most Republicans are just like us, actually. They are waiting for the final outcome. They are being attentive. And they don't want to take risks. They don't want to take electoral risks. And this is actually the constant behavior of Republicans ever since 2015 and 2016. 4 years ago, we saw exactly the same thing. Republican leaders, the Republican establishment, did not have the courage to face up against Trump. They waited for things to be decided. They back in 2016, they never endorsed, for instance, someone who could be labeled as the anti-Trump candidate. I mean, to put it in a very blunt way, those Republican leaders back in 2016 were cowards. They never tried to risk their political survival by opposing Trump. And there is actually, for people who are interested on that count, there is a very good article by David Kerbel in 2016 or 2017, explaining the reason why those Republican leaders back in 2016 did not try to face up against Trump. And I think we're saying the very same story here again, meaning that the Republican establishment is wary. The Republican establishment doesn't want to take electoral risks, and the Republican establishment is waiting for things to be decided by other forces, not themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There is one comment now, kind of directly related to this an issue, saying that some analysts argue that the Grand Old Party is silently hoping for a Biden White House with a conservative-controlled Senate, seen as the best outcome for them. So, do you see the Grand Old Party closing the Trump chapter in this election and rather prepare for the Trump comeback in 2024? So
that's a good question. That's a good and smart question, because I think that actually a Biden White House with a GOP-controlled Senate would be a good configuration or a propitious configuration for the Republican establishment to be able to push part of their agenda and slowly moving beyond the Trump episode. I think also that if Trump is defeated in 2020, and I would be curious to know what Frank thinks about it, but if Trump is defeated in 2020, I don't think he could come back in 2024, 4 years later. I don't think so. I don't see that happening. You could have a Trump-like candidate in 2024, that's for sure. But Trump himself, if he is defeated, I don't think that he would come back in 2024. But again, I would like to hear what Frank has to say about it.
I have a philosophy about politics. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a philosophy about politics. Always expect the unexpected. So sure, Trump could come back. But François, you said that someone like Trump. So the racial reckoning is still taking place. There has to be a shakeout and a fallout from this current election. We as a nation, the United States, we need a debrief, and we need to experience life without Trump. And then when the American population can take a sigh of relief and experience politics without Trump in our face every day, all day long, with tweets and breaking norms and setting his hair on fire every other day, then we can maybe think about what the GOP would look like and its role in our politics. But it's very difficult to discern that right now in the middle of it. I don't see another Trump-like candidate. The kind of voting that we've seen by the different elements of the electorate, I believe won't permit it. You talked about the conservative or the Republican Party agenda. They're very happy with what Trump has accomplished. The tax cuts, the appointments in the Supreme Court, the appointments on federal courts across the country. There's been a takeover of state legislatures across the country, dominated by the GOP. We're in the middle of a census, which means redistricting. And those battles will make their way where, François? They will make their way to federal courts that are dominated by Trump appointees, right? And so the battle lines have been drawn, as Kerbel pointed out. He said that we're feeling like it's 1860. That was an important number, a year to point out. That was before the Civil War. The question becomes, what is this war going to look like? How's it going to manifest itself in our politics? and we're still in the middle of it. So it's kind of it's difficult to kind of figure out what it's going to look like moving forward.
Yeah. What I understood, François, from your argument is also that it is Trumpism, your argument about the let's say more cultural changes in political communication and interaction in the political sphere, that this will also this will, apart from the institutional changes that you, Frank, now mention, that the cultural change will rather stick in contrast to some figure that is a bit Trump-like or more or less in the future.
Well, can I say something about what that culture looks like, right? So that's a racist culture, right? So Trump was guilty of dog whistle. It wasn't even dog whistle politics. He was overt and open about it. And think about it. Trump didn't lose. America lost because around, I don't know what the number is going to end up. If it's 75, 76, 77 million people voted for Donald Trump, right? So we are in a completely divided nation. And to try to figure out the path forward through either political party is almost impossible to figure out at this point. I'm with you, Francois. I appreciate the Morning in America. I remember that. That's how old I am. When that came out in the MOUR, Morning in America, and I know the folks in Lincoln Project, they're trying to figure out what their party is going to look like. There is no organized head of the Republican Party. There's no titular head of the Republican Party right now. That all has to be sorted out. And so, being to your question about their silence, they want judges. They want tax cuts. There are things that they wanted that they could never get with other presidents that they got with Donald Trump. And so they literally made the deal with the devil.
Okay.
If I can just react to, what Frank said, Frank, you said that that there wouldn't be a Trump-like candidate in 2024. So what would you expect? I mean, if not a Trump-like candidate, like what, a more traditional or a conservative evangelical?
Well, don't we have to give them a chance to kind of sort out the aftermath of what just occurred? I mean, I don't like to speculate on a November 6th right now with this. I'm trying to look at their leadership. I'm trying to look at if they had potential candidates, I mean, many of them left the Senate, right? Flake in Arizona, people resigned, people didn't run for re-election. It's very difficult to discern the direction first of all, you're asking me to make that speculation, and I live on the other side of the political spectrum. Just to be quite honest, I live on the other side. But it's hard for me to wrap my head around what the set of issues would be and what a candidate could run on that side of the spectrum in national politics moving forward. It's hard for me to wrap my head around that because our racial reckoning still has to be worked out. Right? Can I tell you something? You know, you're forcing me to think about this a little bit. George W. Bush was too late, was too early. A compassionate conservative type, maybe.
Okay.
Someone along those lines. I mean, Bush he reached out. He was terrible with Hurricane Katrina, but I mean, he reached out with his faith-based initiative. He made some inroads with Black churches in the Black community. That type of compassionate conservative, there may be some room for that. But on the left, I think that they're impatient. They want change now. And I think that you're going to see that kind of dominate our politics for the next 2 or 3 cycles. That's what I see happening. And that pushback, think about the expectation. You said there was an expectation that there'd be a blue wave to counteract the 2018 midterm. I didn't see it that way. So I live here in Pennsylvania. There are 67 counties in Pennsylvania, and the urban core is in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia on the west and east coast of the state. But in the middle of that state is very rural and very conservative. And I remember going to rallies in those conservative rural counties and when John McCain and Sarah Palin were the Republican nominees, when Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan were the nominees. And you would get 200 or 300 people at the rallies for Republicans. Well, when Trump went to those same places in 2016, there were 1,500 and 2,000. And right then I knew that he could win Pennsylvania in 2016. And if you look at what he produced now, his numbers increased. His numbers increased. So I don't see that blue wave. I see us at still locked in that battle right now. Too early to tell what direction it's going to go in. He increased his vote totals. You know, House members across the country lost seats. I'm not surprised by that at all. I've knocked on these people's doors. This is anecdotal. It's not scientific and it's not empirical, but I certainly know in the 67 counties here in Pennsylvania is that they agree with Donald Trump, his view and vision of America. They agree with it. They see it as a zero-sum game, and they see themselves as white and rural and poor and losing, and black and urban and gaining. And that's highly problematic in our domestic politics right now.
Good. I'm seeing that we are coming to the end of our webinar in terms of the time is up, unfortunately. Maybe I can give both speakers the opportunity for some last comments. We unfortunately don't have time to come back to all the questions asked in the chat, but I would just like to invite you to some concluding reflections, maybe also a bit in looking into the future. Where are we going from here, not in terms of immediate election outcomes, but in the longer run? And one thing that I found intriguing looking at the whole situation in the US is the deep divide of society. So how about how to deal in the future, how to deal with that divide, with all those conflicts? Is there some opportunity to get towards more unity, which is, we can say the first name of the United States is to be united, but of course this is not what we see today. So where to go from here? Maybe Frank, just you.
I think so Dr. King has a famous book, right? Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? I see more chaos. Mm-hmm. I see the divide widening. I see very limited opportunities for unity or coming together. And I see the Biden presidency as transitional, right? I don't see it as 8 years. I see it as 4. And I see it as transitional. And so I look to the next cycle, the next 4 years, as an opportunity for America to kind of figure out who we are. Who are we, right? And what do we value? And where do we want to go? And how will that manifest in our politics, right? And so I think that that's what you're going to see transpire over the next 48 months during a Biden administration, right? That's my sense. Now, when I walk into a classroom of young people, I always think about community and I think about the possibilities moving forward. And then I look at the Black electorate and the young people that were involved in that. I am extremely hopeful about the next generation in terms of the leadership that they can provide, their intellectual prowess, their diversity, their progressiveness, their forward thinking. So I'm very encouraged in that regard. So literally one generation is going to pass the torch to the next generation. So I'm very hopeful past a Biden administration that's the kind of place that we're in right now. But I truly see the Biden administration as just a transitional period in American politics.
Thank you, Frank. François, do you have any concluding reflections on what to expect in the future?
Well, actually, I think I tend to share Frank's opinion. I am also a little bit pessimistic about the possibilities for polarized society like the American society to somehow be united in the near future. The only silver lining I see out of this 2020 cycle is the turnout. The fact that Americans participated in huge numbers in that election, and I think that this is a very positive development for the future. But unfortunately, I think that polarization is here to stay in the US. And I don't see how it could change quickly. Okay, so we will have other election cycles like this. The country is very divided. But if I may add another remark, I see that there are questions on foreign policy. And I would just like to make one remark. American foreign policy is also very polarized. It's also very polarized because Americans do not participate in international treaties anymore. What Americans do is that they sign executive agreements. Executive agreements, which is a legal instrument that only the US has to make things simple. And those executive agreements can be signed easily by one president and then canceled by another president just as easily. And we saw it happening with the transition between Obama and Trump. Obama signed 2 executive agreements, an executive agreement for Iran, for instance, and an executive agreement for the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement. And what Trump did right away was to cancel both agreements. And this breeds uncertainty for European partners. It means that American foreign policy can change very quickly in a very abrupt fashion from one president to the next. And this is something that allies don't like. And so the expectation here for me as a European would be that at long last, Europeans get united and be able to face up to the uncertainty coming from the US, which is bound to happen again.
Good.
And that is it.
Shall we leave it here? Thank you so much for your inputs. Thank you very much to Professor François Vergniolle de Chantal for your inputs. Thank you to Professor Frank Pryor for your input, and also thanks to Professor Matthew Kerbel, who had to leave earlier. I also would like to thank the audience. I regret that we did not have time to cover all questions, but I think it was a really thought-provoking, very interesting discussion, and this will certainly continue. And of course, we will also continue to follow the final, the latest developments and the final outcome of this election. So yes, thanks for this event. It was lovely to talk to you, to discuss, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.